Great, well, thanks very much for having me along to speak today. And as I say, lovely to see everybody in person. I have probably met the vast majority over Teams or Google Meet over the course of the last couple of years, which is how long we've been helping with this project at Morrisons. It's been really exciting and interesting to do so. So my background is very much in terms of measurement and monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions at a farm scale. I've worked for about the last 15 years now, both at a national inventory scale but also at farm scale, and understanding the inputs and outputs that go into farming systems and their impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But going a little bit further back than that, I'm very much approached this from a farm systems perspective. I studied agriculture, I worked as an agriculture consultant for a number of years before going more into sort of policy research. So I've always sort of approached this with that farm systems and understanding. So when we're measuring and monitoring emissions, we really want to be thinking about that sort of context of those inputs and those outputs. So I'll touch on that through these slides. I've set a bit of context to start the presentation. I'm going to trot through it pretty quickly because some of it has been covered in the previous slides by Michael already and by Sophie. So I'll go through that fairly quickly. And then the bits I want to sort of get into the detail on is the importance of the measurement and monitoring process. And then just looking through some of the output of the data collected and analysed so far through this project on each of the product groups that we're looking at. And then finally, I just want to go through a case study. We've been working really closely with the beef blueprint farms that we mentioned previously. And I want to sort of go through the process of a sort of deep dive into the various emission sources and how we are looking to reduce those to get towards what I would refer to as a theoretical minimum. It's that how low can you go emission. So, as I say, some of this has been covered already, but I think it's worth just dwelling a moment on why we're doing this. This is a trajectory of CO2 concentrations and greenhouse gas emission concentrations in the atmosphere, and this is what's driving climate change. And the thing that sort of, I think, brought us all of us here today is around the Paris Agreement. So 2015 was the COP, which really agreed this limit to 1.5 degrees to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. But going back a little bit further on that, it's worth noting that the UK has been a real leader in this, going back to 2008 before. We were the first country to set legally binding targets on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And we continue to lead that way. We're the first country to implement legally binding net zero strategy, and organisations like Morrisons are really, and Hugh with the commitments around net zero, are really sort of following that lead and being global leaders in this area. I think it's worth just sort of dwelling on that just for a moment. This has been covered, so I'm not going to go into detail on it. Earlier it was mentioned, what does net zero mean? I would like to use this to sort of demonstrate what net zero actually means in terms of the balance of emissions from our agricultural systems, so looking at feed, fertiliser, manure management, the enteric fermentation emissions, and also the energy and fuel that goes into systems. And how low can we go, how much can we bring those down, and then what is then required to achieve the net position is the sequestration from our soils and our woody biomass in the forms of trees, hedgerows, and other crops. So, thinking about the baseline, why do we do it? We need to know what the starting position is if we're going to understand what the trajectory forward looks like. In order to say what the most appropriate actions are going to take, is we need to understand what the emission sources look like from each of our production systems that we're looking at. That allows us to develop key performance indicators, which can then drive that emissions reductions to support the implementation of the price. And then we come back around to measure that progress and see where we're at. And then also continue to look at what innovations might be available to us in the sector to continue to drive down emissions. It was referred to earlier about biological processes. When we look at other sectors within the economy, many of them find it much more easy to decarbonise because effectively you can substitute fossil fuels with renewable energy, for example. In agriculture, we are completely reliant on biological processes, the key ones being nitrification, denitrification, leading to nitrous oxide emissions, and the other being enteric fermentation and the subsequent manure that needs to be managed off the back of that. So we are relying on those biological processes in the essential activity of food production. So when we look at the efficiency of the system, Michael alluded to this earlier, efficiency is what will drive down emissions. It will also lead to improved profitability on farm in most cases as well. So there's a real co-benefit around that. So looking at farm inputs, feed, fertiliser, fuel, electricity, and the livestock which come into the system, and then how they are managed within the process to generate the outputs. That's really what we're assessing when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and it all boils down to resource efficiency at the end of the day. And how are we doing that? So emissions intensity is essentially the emissions that are generated divided by output, and that's why it's such a key proxy for efficiency within the production system. Our approach is to look at, as much as possible, the key activity data which is going to populate this calculation. So, it's been mentioned that there are many tools. Just about every engagement that I have, we talk about the tools and the relative strengths and weaknesses of different tools. I like to talk about activity data as being the primary motivator, the primary driver for the emissions intensity calculation. We can put rubbish information into any tool, and it'll generate the wrong answer. If we get really good data flowing into the right systems, then we will get the right answers coming in, and it will inform the decisions in the future how we drive down emissions. So, one take home from my perspective is think about the activity data and how to get it into the system as efficiently as we can. So we're always looking for the best means of accessing that information, whether it be through BCMS records or farm management software or anything else. It's not always that easy, but actually we've been doing a lot of work in this area to try and streamline the process, reduce administrative burden, but the really beneficial output is the improvement in accuracy of data which can then inform future decisions. So I'm just going to chop through really quickly each of the product areas that we're looking at key sources of emissions. So potatoes is the first one we're going to look at, and look at the emissions intensity range here. My pointer. From about 0.1 to 0.112, so very close range in terms of the emissions that we've got. So this is about 100 kilos per tonne potatoes produced. That's the emissions intensity of that product. Now that may mean something to you, may be less meaningful. What's important is then what the actions you take off the back of it. And we start to look at, well, what's the breakdown of the emission sources from that. And fertiliser tends to occupy a large proportion of all variable system emissions. So whether that's the production of the fertiliser coming into the system or the nitrous oxide emissions on application of that fertiliser. So in this situation, we've got 37% arising from the use of nitrogen fertiliser. So that's a key area there, and there's going to be a workshop tomorrow where we're going to go into a bit more detail on this. But things like variety choice, so you're optimising yield for lower inputs. I think we've got a speaker that's going to touch upon that in more detail tonight. In potato systems, we've also got high energy use in the field, more so than any other, because we're moving a lot of soil around. So things like efficiency within tractors, hydrogen fuel cells, these sorts of things are going to come more and more important within the system in the future. One thing that we've not highlighted here on the slide is the challenges that we've got within potato production systems, which is essentially the fact that we are moving a lot of soil around, which leads to the loss of organic matter in the soil, and that's where we really need to see some innovation coming into the sector here to try and look at ways of retaining organic matter within soils and potentially look at ways of growing potatoes without shifting quite so much soil around. Moving into soft fruits, we're working closely with a single producer here and going into quite a lot of detail in terms of their emissions profile, working closely with the team here at Harper to do some modelling, life cycle assessment modelling of this production system. And it's been a really interesting process actually, because if we just simply look at the whole enterprise, we come out with this emissions intensity of 0.225 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram product. But then when you start drilling down in a bit more detail of the different product areas, then you get some more insightful things, and it just helps generate a bit more reaction time around things. So in order to meet different markets, we've got dual layer plants here in different systems, heated and non-heated, and then in polytunnels, and then you've got the Everbearer product here, which has got a longer growing season. So it's interesting just looking at the breakdown of these different product groups and their relative emissions in each of those areas, because they have slightly different approaches to each of those. And just understanding actually what that means in terms of the net zero position. Are we more likely to get to a net zero position with the ever-bearer crop first, or we can get there with the earlier production systems? So things like plants are really important here. I was talking to the producer a moment ago and saying, well, how do we carry plants from one season to the next? And again, we're talking about innovation here to help with that process. Pork. Looking at emissions intensity ranges here, we've got 4.22 up to 5.28 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram produced. And really, we've got two key sources of emission arising here. One, feed, 76% of emission arising from feed input there, and then manure management. So the key areas of focus: feed efficiency, feed conversion rates, and the composition of that feed that's going into the animals as well. We do see big variability in different diets, often with a similar protein content. So having a closer look at that feed composition, looking at the value of some of the homegrown feeds that are available as well. We've recently been doing some work for a poultry producer where we're looking at in far more detail on the emissions associated with the production of the homegrown feed, and we're seeing roughly about 40% reduction in the emissions intensity of some of the homegrown products versus the standard emissions factors that are available to us. So I think that's a big area of improvement we've got there. So other areas, obviously, health and fertility and the manure management process as well. So we're looking at ways of storage of that manure to avoid the nitrous oxide and methane emissions. Moving into land production, which is moving into the ruminants now, and ruminant animals emissions tend to be dominated by that enteric fermentation share. We've got a bit under 60% of the emissions associated with the land production here. We've got a reasonably big range actually worth noting here, 11.6 up to 39.27. And this is from real farms, real farm data. And the reason we've got quite such a big range is in certain situations we've got store animals being bought into the system as well, which have a lower emissions intensity. And at the other end there may be flocks in transition, either increasing or decreasing herd numbers, which can have quite a big impact on the overall emission intensity. And say that average though is around about where we want to be, so it's 19.78. It's a relatively efficient system within the land production area. Working with the project farms here, we've identified a number of areas of focus. So things like animal health and fertility is an obvious one. And that links really closely to things like lamb survival rate and ewe efficiency. So how many kilograms of lamb are we getting out per kilogram of ewes in the flock? So key metrics there that we're developing, and then we're relaying these metrics back based on the data we're collecting via the platform that we've got to communicate this with the farmers. Beef finishing. So again, we've got a fairly wide range, 2.84 up to 17.84 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Again, that's generally speaking because we've got quite a diversity of production systems in here, ranging from finishing units where animals may spend 100 days on the farm, because we're looking at farm-based emissions here. And then up to 17.84, which is animals which are spending much, much longer on the farm, and that includes some of the beef systems which are removing some of the embedded emissions associated with the livestock moving into the farm. Again, similar sorts of situation where we've got feed being a key area here, so how efficiently are we able to feed the animals to get them to a finishing weight as quickly as possible, using sustainable diets, and that's part of the sort of incentivization scheme that we mentioned earlier. So how do we get animals to a market-ready position as quickly as possible, reducing sort of what I refer to as redundancy in that growth cycle. Then separating breeder finishes, cow-calf systems, which inevitably have a higher emissions intensity due to the fact that we're carrying effectively the burden of the cow in the system or in one of the finished systems previously. So we have broken down the emissions here according to the breeding stock element. It's about 30% enteric fermentation emissions from that, and then the young stock in the system as well, further 30%. And then these are the inputs which are basically going into the system in addition to the management there. So I'm going to go into this system in a bit more detail because we've got a case study where we've done a bit of a deeper dive, so I'm not going to dwell too much, but similar situation with the land, feed efficiency, composition, animal health and fertility becomes more important here as well, where you've got the breeding occurred in humans there. Nitrogen use efficiency is probably a more general point. Nitrogen use efficiency is actually a really key element here. A lot of our fossil fuel dependency is related to the nitrogen that we're bringing into the system. So I think as much as we can remove nitrogen from the system and maintain productivity is going to be really beneficial. Things like soil health is a really critical component of that, where we start thinking about a carbon cycle rather than a nitrogen cycle. Reduce the reliance on imported nitrogen generally. Final product to look at is eggs, so we've been working really closely with Eggbase, who are running actually the calculations through their own system here. This is the range that we're seeing between 1.95 and 3.67, heavily sort of driven by diet and diet composition here. So Sophie's mentioned the work that's been done on things like insect feed, but also removing soils in the diet, and also looking at a more detailed assessment of overall feed will be really important to driving down that feed share of emissions there and the overall absolute emissions from feed. So just moving quickly into the case study that we're developing. This looks like a graph of orthodoxy, it's probably just the case. But what this tells us about farm system is really interesting. This is where I start when I'm looking at a farm. And this is effectively a graphic representation of BCMS data. And what we can see is different animal events happening here, signified by different dots. So we've got births on the bottom here, moved off animals to an unholding, not to, moved on in the light green and moved off as slaughtered and moved off as store animals or other breeding grounds. The reason I start here is because it gives us a really good indication of the context of the farming system. So we know this is a beef sucker unit, we know we've got a spring calving unit, pretty tight cock calf. We know we're finishing a group of animals here at 12 to 13 months, but there's another group of animals who are coming through here and being finished later on, moving off to other markets a little bit later on. It's a really interesting and useful part of the analysis here, where we can basically form a vision of the farm system without actually having asked too many questions of the farmer. Just going through a little bit about how we're representing the data or presenting the data back to farmers. This is the farm metrics platform that we're using. And we develop these dashboards to show emissions intensity benchmark against other farm systems, emissions intensity breakdown by gases, and importantly, this overall emissions intensity. We are including some degree of sequestration in this analysis, which is taking account of some of the land use. I would sort of strongly caveat that because it's indicative in certain circumstances. We've got really detailed information, in certain other ones we're making other assumptions on things like soil organic matter baselines and things like that, which are really strong, have a strong influence on the ultimate output. But I think it's important to provide some degree of indication in that area as well. We've then got slightly more detail around that breakdown of emissions, and then we look at some things that are influencing it, so things like I mentioned, health, fertility, basis, long-term fertilizer and feed use. But then we translate that data into this KPI dashboard that we've developed. So we're not necessarily collecting any additional data. This is all driven by the data and activity data that we've collected to do the emissions calculation. And this is, I think, where it gets interesting and really becomes useful. I suppose my ambition is to move something from being a sort of interesting greenhouse gas emissions intensity figure to being something that's useful and will drive change and drive emissions reduction on the farm. So the areas that we're really looking at these fertility measurements in terms of cows per calf, age of first calving, things like calves born within the first 3 weeks and calves born within the first 6 weeks of calving starting, which are really strong indicators for that efficiency that run through the system. Health, we're using some mortality figures here as a proxy for overall health, and then nutrition in terms of the age of slaughter, average daily live weight gain, and average dead weight. So this, again, puts it on a red, amber, green rating, so it's indicative of where the opportunities might lie. Also on the farm metrics dashboard, we've got the kill data represented graphically here as well, so you can see the spread of different animals being finished at different times and by grade as well. It's just additional tool that we're making available. So we've got the data and we're also representing it this way. So just taking a bit more of an in-depth analysis, when you do this, you start to see systems within systems. And this being one of the blueprint farms, we've got a situation where all male animals are left entire and finished at that 12 to 13 months, 30 months on average. And we've also got this cohort of female animals. So the really primary objective of this farm is to sell breeding females, but not all of them make the grade. And so they've got this cohort which are ending up go to the market there as well. So we really want to pull that apart and start thinking about, well, what are the key actions for these animals, males, what they actually see, so we can maybe think about how we pull finished house forward a bit, how you remove some of these animals from the system as well. We're working really closely with the team at Raft to be able to work with the farms and their vets and their nutritionists to be able to basically try and look at how we assess the measures which are going to improve those sorts of pictures there. But bear in mind, we are working with a couple of really, really efficient farms here already. It's not always that obvious, it's not always that easy to find the big opportunities. So really a lot of this is about marginal gains as well. I'll illustrate that in a couple of slides back. But again, we're looking at kill weights and slaughter weights here, so you see the distribution. And ultimately, sort of by being able to move that kill date forward a bit without challenging the animals, without incurring any animal health impacts, and being able to do it so they're reaching higher weights is going to be an optimal position as long as we're not putting in too much additional feed into the system. So just looking at those two groups and looking at the relative impact on the emissions intensity. So we've got that male group of animals here, which is achieving an emissions intensity of 10.14 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of dead weight. Whereas actually then we've got these female groups here, which on average, not including the cow, is about 14.87 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of dead weight. So you see the relative importance of the average slaughter time frames of these graphs. So just finally looking at a couple of outcomes and sort of scenario planning developments that we've been working on. I'm not going to go through line by line, but effectively this is what we've effectively called our build a cow model. So you can effectively put all of your key parameters into the system. So you put in your birth weight, your weights of the cow, predicted mature weights, all of these things which drive emissions quite closely, but doesn't necessarily require you to put in all of the activity data into the system. So you can actually model the system based on KPIs effectively. And then your inputs of nitrogen, fertilizer, bedding and feeding into the system as well. So these are calf inputs, these are cow inputs, and this looks at the lifetime of the cow. So we're effectively looking at how many calves have been born, what age the first calving was, how much feeding cows going over into the lifetime of that animal, and then we're allocating those emissions per calf. So we get a much better view of the life cycle of the cow-calf system through this model. So this is basically a baseline position. All the data has been put in there based on the actual situation on the farm. And then having spoken to the blueprint farmer, we get to go through a few key activities. So bringing forward protection, finishing time frames, looking at herd rate, mortality, and replacement rates here, and then looking at removing inorganic nitrogen from the system completely, and that's an aspiration for this particular farm. So we're modelling what that actually looks like in terms of emissions intensity. So then when we look at the two systems compared to one another, the key point to look at really is where we were at the baseline, and actually the baseline is coming out to 227.55 based on the way information is put into the system here. And then what we see is that is based on those parameter changes that we've made, reduction in inputs, the improvements in some of the fertility measures, we can get to that sort of 23.93 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So it's a 13% reduction in emissions from in an already very efficient cow-calf production system. I talk about this term theoretical minimum. This is kind of where we want to be targeting. This is the optimum position for emissions intensity based on the business as usual case. So we're not throwing in any feed additives into the system yet. We can do that But this is a sort of business as usual theoretical that we want to be sort of working towards. And I think that helps contextualise targets, not just in beef, but in chronic food. So then that's the kind of how low can you go component. This is the how hard can you grow, but actually beneath ground. So we've done a really intensive process of soil organic carbon measurement monitoring with this farm. We used electromagnetic conductivity scanning to determine in-field variability and texture difference in the change, which helped within the field, which helped determine sampling points and take the baseline measurements. Baseline measurements are really important if we're going to get any degree of accuracy in our soil carbon sequestration capability in the future. So I'm getting 5-minute warnings about short through. We then run that through the Rothsey dynamic soil carbon tool out to 2050. Now, this provides, based on the baseline information we've got, the trajectory of soil carbon sequestration, which is available to us in theory, based on the model. There are a number of different dynamic models. So there's Bayescent, Landscape, DNDC, and Rothsey, all are the sort of 3 main ones. And we're kind of playing around with each of them to try and figure out which one's the best ones for the systems that we're looking at. So what we're working with here is actually high clay content soils. So you see some of these permanent grass in fields. These are permanent grass, are really high in organic matter already, and high carbon content soils. To put that in context, at farm at home, we did a similar exercise. And we're quite sandy-based soils, and we're not, even on permanent grass, aren't exceeding 100 tonnes per hectare of carbon. So this is the importance, and it's mentioned beforehand, the importance of clay content in soil carbon. So what does this show us? In terms of opportunities, we've got an opportunity to build carbon in some of these areas, and this is based on a revised crop rotation, which is incorporating more perennials into the system. So this is an opportunity to grow organic matter of carbon in soils, which not only helps us in the net zero position, which will help nitrogen use efficiency, and hopefully work towards that goal of removing the organic nitrogen in the system. This is a challenge that is a threat because we've got such high organic matters within soil. We've got to make sure we're maintaining that within the system. But it's worth noting that soil carbon can go 2 ways. And when you've got such high levels of organic matter, protection of this is so important. And as important, if not more so, than the building of this end inspection as well. So just a theoretical representation of things in terms of the net zero position. This is kind of a baseline position. I've modelled this up to a carcass level, so emissions per tonne, emissions of tonnes of CO2 equivalent per carcass. So in the baseline position, we're talking about just over 10 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So that, when we're reducing that down to that 23, almost 24 kilograms, then we're down at this sort of level. Again, we're looking at what can we do within the action plan. That's that sort of change soil, that's a change in the rotation that we developed there, and then here's what we biomass could deliver at the right sort of levels. And actually, this is modelled on about 0.3 to 0.4 hectares of woody biomass within the system per carcass, so it's not insignificant, and that actually comes across in some of the stuff that Michael was saying earlier about the large areas. So finally, key points. Developing an accurate greenhouse gas emissions baseline is essential, and that will help inform future strategies for emissions reductions. Emissions reductions are closely linked to production efficiency, as we discussed previously, so that's how low can we go, or how close to the theoretical minimum can we achieve. And then looking at the flip side of that, the additional sequestration opportunities is always going to be needed, that we're going to have sequestration within the system to offset those biological process-driven emissions. So looking at that is essential, but also that point around protection of carbon stock is very important, as well as the emission sequestration. Sequestration opportunities in soil will depend on lots and lots of different variables, and we need to have a really good baseline understanding of soil organic matter and the sort of impact of different measures on farm. And lots of credit to Morrisons for investing in this type of activity, where they're taking a really detailed look at baseline positions so that you can actually understand what the insurance is.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh. Thank you. We have like half a second for questions. Does anybody has a question for Hugh before I'll come forward to Anna? But let's come down then. Anna, ready? Oh, well done, yeah. Thank you.
Shout if you like. Yeah, sorry, Hugh. Thanks very much for that talk. It's just I've got a wider question really. As an industry, do we need to standardise our methodology for creating these baselines? Because at the moment there are quite a number of different companies, organisations working things out quite differently. Do we need to standardise this methodology? Because if we are going to be paid for or monitored, that standardisation I think is pretty key. Otherwise we're not comparing apples with apples.
I can answer that really quickly, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely you need standardisation, and there are some moves afoot to work on that standardisation. There's been an AHDB project looking at the environmental benchmarks and tools that they've developed. I was involved with a dairy roadmap meeting last week, which was looking at standardisation to meet the dairy objectives that they've set, and that was a group of all of the major tool providers around the table there comparing notes on various different methodologies. So I think there's progress in that area, and I think a standardisation is a lot. The one thing I'd say is published methods. You know, I think that's the key thing here, and making sure that everyone's on the same page. The intellectual property of these things is not embedded within the calculations because they're all kind of based on public domain stuff. So published methods. Activity data is key. How activity data is used, how activity data is pushed into these models is more important than the actual model calculation itself in many ways.
Thank you very much. Thank you.